A tense silence settled in the small, dimly lit office as two men faced each other, one fuming with unchecked authority, the other a picture of restrained composure. The officer, burly and arrogant, stood towering, his gaze steely and hard. Without asking, he reached over and shoved the man before him back, sneering as he did so, as if his mere presence alone was a threat. His voice, cold and commanding, cut through the silence with sharp edges. "You think you belong here?" he spat, the question laced with venom. "This isn't the kind of place for people like you to be wandering around, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The man he spoke to said nothing, his face calm but eyes revealing a glimmer of intensity. He'd been prepared for an unfriendly welcome, for this department wasn't known for being inclusive or fair. But the outright hostility and disrespect, that still felt like a slap to the face. He tried to remain measured, aware that a single wrong word could tip this confrontation into dangerous territory. Yet the officer wasn't done. He scoffed, crossing his arms with a smirk. "This is my space," he continued, emphasizing each word. "And people like you don't get to waltz in here acting like you belong." Then, without warning, a clenched fist rose and struck the man squarely in the chest. It wasn't just a punch. It was an insult, a deliberate show of power designed to put the man in his place. The officer's intention was clear: to humiliate, to dominate. The man staggered backward, stunned by the audacity, the raw arrogance in this person who had no idea who he had just assaulted. As he steadied himself, his pulse pounded with a mixture of shock and indignation. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the officer, a silent question brimming with both defiance and control. "You have no idea who I am," he finally said, his voice calm but with an undertone that hinted at deep resolve. The officer, oblivious, laughed mockingly. "I don't need to know who you are. Around here, all that matters is what I say, and what I say is that you don't belong. Now get out." There was a pause, the air thickening with unspoken tension, as the man squared his shoulders. He knew he couldn't back down, not now. He could feel the sting of anger rising, the weight of every unjust moment he'd faced in his career pressing down on him, urging him to act. But he waited. This wasn't the time to reveal himself, not yet. Instead, he took a breath and slowly exhaled, eyes trained firmly on the officer's face. A faint smile flickered across his lips as he said, almost casually, "Are you sure you want to keep talking to me like that?" The officer's smirk faltered, but only for a second. His pride wouldn't let him back down. "You don't scare me. I've dealt with your kind before, full of pride, thinking you're untouchable. But let me make one thing clear. You step into my world, you play by my rules. And if I don't," came the quiet, unyielding response. "If you don't?" The officer chuckled, as if the question were a joke. "Then I'll make you regret it." The man knew, in that instant, what he had to do. He stood taller, unbothered, letting the silence settle before saying, "You just did." The realization dawned too late for the officer. His confident demeanor wavered as he recognized the shift in the man's tone, the slight edge of authority he hadn't noticed before. Panic crept into his eyes, realization dawning as the man finally took out his badge, holding it up with quiet power, revealing his true identity, not just another face, but a law enforcement officer of higher rank, a sheriff. His calm demeanor now held a force that was undeniable, a reminder that respect wasn't given, it was earned. "What?" the officer stammered, his face draining of color. I didn't know," the sheriff's gaze hardened, and his voice was unyielding. "That's the problem, isn't it? You don't think. You don't listen. You just assume." In an instant, the tables had turned. Every ounce of arrogance the officer had carried, every smug word and look, had been shattered by a simple reveal. The sheriff stepped forward, and the officer shrank back, his confidence crumbling. "You didn't think for a second about who I might be, about the consequences," the sheriff continued, his words hitting with the weight of years of silent injustice endured and overcome. "You only saw what you wanted to see." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was trapped, caught by his own assumptions and arrogance. "People like you think you're untouchable," the sheriff said, his voice filled with the gravity of countless moments just like this one, moments where he'd been underestimated, dismissed, and mistreated. "But you're about to learn a lesson you won't forget." The officer, shaking now, barely managed a whisper. "Please. I didn't know. I'm sorry." But it was too late. The sheriff's eyes remained cold, unforgiving. "Sorry won't change what you've done." With deliberate calm, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, holding them up as the officer's eyes widened in horror. "This time, you're going to see what it feels like." The officer's heart pounded with terror as he realized the full extent of his mistake. All the confidence he'd felt, the power he'd wielded so recklessly, vanished in an instant. He was no longer the one in control. He was at the mercy of someone he'd wronged, someone he'd never even thought to respect. And as the sheriff secured the handcuffs around his wrists, the officer felt a cold sense of dread settle over him, a realization that his actions, his words, had led him to this moment. The humiliation he had so easily dished out was now his to endure. Now, as the officer is let out, he has one question searing through his mind: what will the sheriff do next? The tables have turned, but how far will the sheriff go to make sure this lesson is one the officer will never forget? Stay with us as this powerful story of reckoning unfolds, showing that respect isn't demanded through power but earned through humility. This is a lesson that goes far beyond rank and authority, and one man's decision to stand up could change everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. Make sure you're here to see it. Hello, everyone. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in justice, respect, and equality for everyone, especially in the face of prejudice. To every Black viewer watching, know that we see you, support you, and that your story matters. We're here to share stories that reflect the real-life struggles and triumphs of those who face injustice. Now, sit back and enjoy the story we have for you today. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and join us in standing for stories that inspire change. Enjoy the story. In the heart of the small town of Branton, Georgia, a place where everybody knew everybody, life was as typical as it could be. Days passed under a southern sun that gave the town its sleepy, comfortable charm, a place where a stranger's face was rare and a raised eyebrow at new folk was as common as sweet tea on porches. The people of Branton were proud, rooted in generations of tradition. It was a town that held its secrets close and often resisted change, for better or for worse. And here, amidst these quiet streets and close-knit neighborhoods, two men were about to clash in a way that would ripple across the town. On one side was Sheriff Marcus Hayes, a man whose presence was felt as soon as he entered a room. Marcus wasn't just a sheriff by title, he embodied the role with every ounce of his being. Tall and solidly built, with a sharp gaze and calm demeanor, Marcus held himself with an air of authority that wasn't forced. His strength came not from his badge but from the respect he commanded, even in the face of those who might not have wanted to give it. He'd served as sheriff for nearly a decade, a tenure that had seen him make difficult decisions and stand firm on values that he refused to compromise. For Marcus, law enforcement was never about power, it was about responsibility. Born and raised in Branton, he'd felt the weight of his position acutely. Being one of the few Black men to ever hold this role in a predominantly white town hadn't made his journey easy, but it had made it meaningful. He wasn't just enforcing the law, he was trying to bridge gaps, to make the town safer and fairer for everyone, regardless of race or background. It hadn't always been smooth. Marcus knew that some people saw him as a mere figurehead, someone the town council elected to show they were progressive. But to Marcus, this was more than a position, it was a calling. With his calm yet authoritative demeanor, Marcus had earned the trust and admiration of many. Still, there were those who resented him, people who saw his success and influence as a threat to the town's natural order. But Marcus didn't let it show. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a resilience built over years of dealing with skepticism, subtle slights, and outright prejudice. He knew that every day he wore that badge, he was challenging assumptions and, maybe, reshaping minds. On the other side of town was Officer Tom Grayson, a man who joined the police force young and ambitious. Now in his mid-30s, Tom had made a name for himself as an officer who got results, even if his methods were questionable. He was the type who thrived on authority, wearing his uniform as a statement of power rather than protection. To Tom, being an officer meant having control, being the one people had to answer to. He relished that control, using it as a shield and as a weapon, though he rarely admitted it to himself. He'd grown up in a family that valued traditional values, and much of what he'd learned about the world was through a lens that was narrow and unforgiving. Tom's life was a mixture of quiet bitterness and unspoken resentment. Despite his position, he often felt overshadowed, overlooked. In his mind, he should have been much further up the chain by now, and yet here he was, still taking orders from others. His frustration found a convenient target in Marcus Hayes, the man who held a position he privately believed should belong to someone more like him. To Tom, Marcus was an intruder, a symbol of the world shifting in ways he didn't appreciate. And so, he carried a quiet disdain for the sheriff, a simmering hostility that often slipped out in subtle ways. Yet despite their differences, the two men had rarely crossed paths directly. Marcus had an intuition about people, a knack for reading others, and he'd sensed Tom's animosity early on. But he hadn't confronted it. He had his own duties to focus on and trusted that, over time, Tom would either adapt or leave. However, Marcus had also seen enough to know that Tom's behavior was more than just frustration. It was a genuine aversion to authority that came from someone like Marcus. Still, Marcus hoped that professionalism would keep any open conflict at bay. That uneasy balance, however, was about to break. On a cloudy Friday morning, Marcus decided to pay an unannounced visit to the precinct's records room. He'd received reports from community members about Tom's conduct, complaints about his rough treatment of certain citizens during routine stops. Marcus wanted to address the issue discreetly, without stirring trouble, hoping he could guide Tom into understanding that his job wasn't about dominance but service. As sheriff, Marcus believed it was his duty to hold his team accountable, to set a standard for what it meant to serve the community. But as Marcus entered the precinct, he felt the cold stares of a few officers who'd never quite warmed up to him. Ignoring them, he walked purposefully toward the records room. Tom, seeing Marcus approach, felt a jolt of irritation, a flash of anger that simmered below the surface. He was in no mood to deal with the sheriff's holier-than-thou attitude, as he saw it. In his mind, Marcus's very presence was an insult, a reminder that someone else held the power he craved. "Can I help you with something?" Tom's voice dripped with forced politeness as he watched Marcus approach. Marcus, catching the thinly veiled hostility in Tom's eyes, remained calm. "Just here to check up on a few things," he said simply, his tone neutral. Tom didn't move from his position, blocking Marcus's path slightly, as if testing him. "I wasn't aware the sheriff's duties included snooping around our records," he said, his eyes narrowing. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "I believe accountability is part of my duty. If there's an issue, I'm happy to discuss it." Tom let out a derisive chuckle, leaning back with a smirk. "Accountability. Right. Funny how that word keeps coming up these days." Marcus sensed the implication, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he stepped forward, attempting to sidestep Tom. But Tom moved as well, blocking him again, his smirk fading into a sneer. "You walk around here like you own the place," Tom said, his voice low and filled with contempt. "But I don't answer to you, Sheriff. Not in here." The room fell silent, other officers looking away, pretending to focus on their work but listening intently. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, the years of accumulated slights and disrespect all converging in this one encounter. But he kept his voice level, his gaze calm. Officer Grayson, I'm here to ensure that every member of this department is upholding the standards we're sworn to protect. That includes you. Tom's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he felt his control slipping. Standards, he repeated mockingly. Let me tell you something about standards. Some people think they can waltz in, flash a badge, and change everything that's been built up over decades. But some of us, we remember how things used to be, and we're not about to let someone like you come in and tear it all down. Marcus felt a familiar sting, a reminder of the quiet bigotry he'd faced throughout his life. But he didn't let it show. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. I'm here because the people of this town deserve better. And that includes respect, from all of us. Tom, caught off guard by Marcus's calm defiance, felt a surge of anger he couldn't contain. Before he knew it, his fist shot out, landing a hard punch against Marcus's chest, as if trying to erase him from existence, to prove his dominance. A collective gasp filled the room. Marcus stumbled back, the impact of the punch sinking in, the humiliation washing over him. He steadied himself, meeting Tom's gaze, his own eyes filled with a determination that was unbreakable. There was a tense silence as Marcus straightened, his expression cold and unreadable. Tom realized, too late, the magnitude of what he'd done. The room seemed to pulse with silence after the impact. Tom stood there, stunned by his own actions, a flicker of satisfaction twisted by a dawning sense of dread creeping into his expression. Around them, officers were frozen in place, some in shock, others pretending not to notice. Marcus straightened, taking a moment to steady himself, his face unreadable, but his eyes darkened with something new, a quiet storm, held back only by the steeliness in his gaze. Are you done? Marcus's voice was steady, almost too calm, as he spoke to Tom. Tom clenched his jaw, the satisfaction from moments ago evaporating, replaced with a simmering frustration. He shifted his weight but didn't respond, his gaze defiant but flickering. He hadn't expected Marcus to stand so firm, hadn't expected his own anger to feel so out of place now, like a misplaced piece in a puzzle that no longer made sense. Marcus took a small step forward, narrowing the space between them, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in Tom's expression. You've made it clear you have a problem with me, Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. And now, you've made it clear to everyone else here, too. Tom's face flushed, his fists clenching at his sides. He glanced around, feeling the weight of the silent judgment from those watching. The reality of what he'd done was settling in, but he pushed it away, clinging to his pride. Problem with you? Tom scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. The problem is people like you thinking you can waltz in here and change everything. You don't belong here, Sheriff. Not in Branton, not in this precinct. You don't get to come in here and tell us how to do things. Marcus's face remained impassive, but his eyes flashed with something that was impossible to ignore, a blend of anger, disappointment, and a resilience that Tom couldn't shake. It's not about telling anyone what to do, Officer Grayson, Marcus replied, his tone even, unyielding. It's about respect. Something you seem to think only applies to people who look like you. A murmur ran through the room, brief but unmistakable. Tom's face tightened, his composure cracking as his frustration bubbled over. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're better than us, don't you? Tom spat. Better than me. Walking around here like you've earned your place. But we know the truth, Sheriff. You're only here because people like you demanded change, forced the council to give you this job. You don't deserve it. For a moment, Marcus said nothing, allowing the weight of Tom's words to hang in the air. His face remained calm, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew this wasn't just Tom's frustration speaking, it was years of pent-up resentment, directed not only at him but at everything he represented. Deserve? Marcus's voice was low, each word deliberate. You think respect is something you're entitled to, just because of the color of your skin? That's where you're wrong, Tom. Respect is earned, and so is the right to wear that badge. He gestured to Tom's uniform, his gaze hard. You may have the badge, but you lack the decency and honor to wear it. The room fell silent again, every word hanging heavy in the air. Tom's face flushed, his fists tightening, but he didn't respond. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, the silent judgment, and it made his skin crawl. Marcus took a breath, his tone softening, but only slightly. This isn't about you, Tom. Or me. It's about the people we serve, people who deserve officers who treat them with respect. And if you can't see that, if you think this job is about power instead of service, then you don't belong here. For a moment, Tom felt the sting of Marcus's words, a sharp pang of guilt he wasn't prepared for. But he pushed it away, clinging to his anger, his pride. He wouldn't, let Marcus win. Not here, not like this. Don't lecture me, Tom snapped, his voice low, dangerous. I've been here longer than you have. I know this town better than you ever will. You don't get to come in here and tell me how to do my job. Marcus's gaze hardened, but he remained calm, his voice steady. Then prove it, Tom. Prove you're here to serve this community. Show them you're more than just a badge and a uniform. Tom's jaw clenched, his anger bubbling over again. You don't know anything about me, he spat. About what I've done for this town. I don't need your approval, and I sure as hell don't need you looking over my shoulder. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. Then act like it, officer. If you're so sure of yourself, prove it. Show this town, show your fellow officers, that you're here for the right reasons. For a moment, Tom faltered, his confidence shaken. But he quickly recovered, his face hardening once again. You think you're so high and mighty, Sheriff. But you're just a man with a badge, same as me. And one day, people are going to see through you. They're going to realize you're nothing but a fraud. Marcus didn't respond, his silence a stark contrast to Tom's anger. He simply stood there, calm, unyielding, his gaze unwavering. Tom felt his control slipping, his frustration mounting as Marcus remained unmoved. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Tom's voice was a whisper, filled with venom. But everyone's got a weakness. And one day, I'll find yours. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze cool. Is that a threat, officer? Tom smirked, though the confidence in his expression was starting to wane. It's a promise. With that, he turned on his heel, striding out of the room, his back stiff with barely contained anger. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of disappointment and resolve settling over him. He knew this wasn't over, knew that Tom's resentment ran deep, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now. As Tom left the precinct, his mind was racing, his thoughts a blur of anger and frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation, the sting of Marcus's words echoing in his mind. He knew he'd gone too far, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. In his mind, Marcus was still the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd set something in motion, something he couldn't control. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't end here. Marcus had seen through him, had exposed his insecurities, his fears, and it had left him feeling vulnerable in a way he couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the tension at the precinct only grew. Word of the confrontation had spread, whispers and glances filling the halls as officers took sides, some quietly supporting Marcus, others standing with Tom. The atmosphere was charged, every interaction tinged with a simmering hostility that seemed ready to erupt at any moment. Marcus, for his part, remained calm, focused. He knew he couldn't let Tom's animosity distract him, couldn't allow it to undermine his work. But he also knew that the situation was far from over. Tom's resentment was like a ticking time bomb, and Marcus could feel it in the way Tom watched him, the way he spoke to him with barely contained hostility. One evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave, he received a call. It was from a community leader, someone he respected deeply, who expressed concern about Tom's behavior. The community was beginning to notice, to see the cracks in the precinct's facade, and Marcus knew he had to act. He decided to confront Tom one last time, to give him a chance to make things right. But as he walked into the precinct the next day, he could feel the tension in the air, could see the way officers were watching him, waiting. It was as if they knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Marcus found Tom in the break room, sitting alone, his face set in a scowl. He approached him, his expression calm, but his voice firm. "We need to talk, Tom." Tom looked up, his eyes narrowing. "There's nothing to talk about, Sheriff." But Marcus didn't back down. "Yes, there is. This animosity between us, it's affecting the whole department. And it's time we put an end to it." Tom scoffed, crossing his arms. "You think you can just waltz in here and demand respect? It doesn't work that way." "I'm not demanding anything," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "But I am asking you to consider what's best for this town. For the people we're here to serve." Tom's face hardened, his eyes filled with resentment. "This town doesn't need you, Sheriff. It was just fine before you came along, and it'll be fine without you." Marcus sighed, a hint of sadness in his expression. "Maybe that's what you believe, Tom. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither is the responsibility we all have to serve this community with respect." There was a long pause, the tension between them thick, heavy. Tom's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to lash out, to throw back every insult that came to mind, but something in Marcus's calm, unyielding gaze held him back. Marcus finally turned to leave, his voice soft but firm as he spoke. "Think about what kind of officer you want to be, Tom. And remember, it's never too late to change." As Marcus walked away, Tom felt a flicker of doubt, a pang of something he couldn't quite name. But he pushed it down, clinging to his anger, his pride. The stage was set, the tension ready to explode. And as Tom watched Marcus walk away, he knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. Something was coming, something that would leave them both changed forever. The precinct buzzed under the fluorescent lights, a quiet, nervous energy hanging in the air as the clock ticked past midnight. Shadows stretched across desks and walls, casting an eerie glow over a normally bustling space that now lay subdued, as if waiting. Officer Tom Grayson sat alone in the small break room, staring at a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't untangle, frustration and anger twisting into something darker, more unsettled. He felt trapped, cornered, a dangerous feeling simmering in his gut. A knock on the door jarred him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Sheriff Marcus Hayes standing there, his face calm but serious, eyes locked onto Tom with a gaze that seemed to cut through every pretense, every mask. Tom's jaw tightened, his fingers clenched around his coffee cup. He'd wanted this confrontation, had craved it, and yet now, faced with Marcus's unflinching stare, a flicker of doubt slid through his mind. Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The silence grew thick, filling the space between them with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured, carrying the weight of his own frustrations, his own simmering resolve. "Tom," Marcus began, his tone firm but not harsh, "I think it's time we lay everything on the table." Tom leaned back, crossing his arms with a defiant sneer. "Oh, you think so, Sheriff?" he shot back, sarcasm dripping from his words. "Funny, I didn't realize we were on such friendly terms." Marcus ignored the barb, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about friendship. This is about respect. It's about the damage you're causing here, to this department and this town." Tom chuckled, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed off the walls. "Respect," he muttered. "You keep using that word like it means something. But you don't know a damn thing about me, Sheriff. You think you can just walk in here, throw your weight around, and act like you're the big man?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Is that really what you think this is about? That I'm here to prove something? Tom's eyes flashed with resentment. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? With your calm voice, your fancy title. It's all just a show, Sheriff. Underneath it all, you're just another man, same as me. And we both know you don't belong here. Marcus took a deep breath, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. You're right about one thing, Tom. I am just a man. But that's where the similarities end. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Because, unlike you, I didn't take this job to hold power over others. I took it to serve. To protect. And if you can't see the difference, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. Tom's face reddened, his hands balled into fists as he glared at Marcus. Don't lecture me, Hayes. You think you're better because you wear that badge, because you put on this act like you're some kind of saint. But I know the truth. You're just here because they needed someone to tick a box, to make the council look good. You don't deserve this job. Marcus's jaw tightened, a hint of anger flashing in his eyes, but he kept his voice steady. And you think you do? You think bullying people, throwing your weight around, makes you a good cop? Tom scoffed, rolling his eyes. You wouldn't understand. People around here, they don't respect weakness. They respect strength. They need someone who's not afraid to take control. Control. Marcus shook his head slowly, disappointment evident in his tone. This job isn't about control, Tom. It's about service. And if you can't see that, if you're so blinded by your need to feel important, then you don't understand what it means to wear that uniform. Tom clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to contain the anger boiling inside him. Don't you dare talk down to me, Marcus, he spat, his voice low and dangerous. You might be sheriff, but that doesn't make you better than me. I'm not trying to be better than you, Tom, Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. But I am trying to be better for this community. And if that means standing up to people like you, then so be it. Tom's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in his gaze. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You really think you can change things, don't you? That you can come in here and make people respect you, make me respect you? Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. Respect isn't something you demand, Tom. It's something you earn. And right now, you're doing the opposite. Tom took a shaky breath, his composure slipping as the truth of Marcus's words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but deep down, he knew that Marcus was right. The years he'd spent lording over others, demanding respect, had left him feeling hollow, as if he were grasping at something he could never truly hold. But he couldn't admit that. Not to Marcus. Not to anyone. Fine, Tom finally muttered, his voice thick with resentment. Think whatever you want, Sheriff. But one day, people are going to see you for what you really are. And when they do, don't expect any sympathy from me. Marcus nodded slowly, a hint of sadness in his gaze. I don't need sympathy, Tom. I need officers who understand what it means to serve. And if you can't be that, then maybe it's time for you to reconsider why you're here. The silence that followed was deafening, both men locked in a tense standoff, neither willing to back down. Finally, Marcus turned to leave, but Tom's voice stopped him. You think you've won, don't you? Tom sneered, his voice dripping with bitterness. But this isn't over, Hayes. Not by a long shot. Marcus paused, glancing back over his shoulder with a calm, steady gaze. It's not about winning, Tom. It's about doing what's right. And if you can't see that, then you're only hurting yourself. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. But as Marcus walked down the hallway, his mind was racing, a sense of unease settling over him. He knew that Tom's resentment wasn't going to disappear overnight, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test him in ways he wasn't prepared for. As he reached his office, he found a small envelope waiting for him on his desk, his name scrawled across the front in a messy, hurried script. Frowning, he picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hand, a strange sense of foreboding creeping over him. He opened the envelope, unfolding the note inside, his eyes scanning the words hastily written in a familiar hand. The message was short, direct, and chilling. You think you're untouchable, but everyone has a breaking point. Watch your back, Sheriff. This isn't over. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read the words, a sense of dread settling over him. He knew that Tom was responsible, knew that his resentment had finally reached a boiling point. But he also knew that he couldn't let fear control him. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let Tom's threats shake his resolve. Taking a deep breath, he folded the note and placed it in his desk drawer, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the precinct as officers began filtering in, nodding greetings and exchanging murmurs, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Sheriff Marcus Hayes sat alone in his office, his gaze distant, his thoughts haunted by Tom's threat from the previous night. He could still feel the weight of those words, the seething resentment hidden within them. They were more than a challenge, they were a promise. And Marcus knew better than to ignore a promise like that. His fingers brushed against the drawer where he'd stashed the note, feeling its presence like a ticking clock, reminding him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he couldn't let himself get distracted by Tom's anger. He had a job to do, and he was determined not to let one man's bitterness jeopardize the integrity of the department. Yet, the memory of the cold threat lingered, leaving a sour taste in his mouth. A sharp knock on his door broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see Deputy Sandra Willis standing in the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern. Sandra was one of his most trusted deputies, a woman of quiet strength who had joined the force with a dedication to making her town a better place. She, more than anyone, knew the weight Marcus carried as sheriff in a town that wasn't always kind to outsiders, especially ones like him. "Sheriff," she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to enter. He could tell by the look in her eyes that something was troubling her, something she didn't want to say in front of the others. Sandra closed the door behind her, her gaze flicking briefly to the drawer where Marcus had stashed the note. "I wanted to talk to you about Officer Grayson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's been talk. People are noticing the tension between you two, and it's starting to affect the rest of the team. Some of the younger officers, they're looking up to him, and I'm worried that," she trailed off, her concern evident as she searched for the right words. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he listened intently. Sandra's loyalty was unwavering, and if she was bringing this to him, he knew it was serious. "What are you worried about, Sandra?" he asked, his voice calm but urging. She sighed, choosing her words carefully. "I'm worried that he's stirring up resentment against you, Sheriff. Some of the things he's saying, it's not just personal anymore. He's making it about more than just the two of you." Marcus's expression hardened, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. He'd hoped that Tom's anger would stay contained, that it wouldn't spill over to the rest of the department. But now, he realized, Tom wasn't content with keeping this between them. He wanted to undermine Marcus's authority, to erode the respect that Marcus had spent years earning. "Thank you for telling me," Marcus replied quietly, his voice filled with a calm resolve. "I'll handle it." Sandra hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and admiration. She knew how difficult this was for him, knew the burden he carried as both sheriff and as a man who had to constantly prove himself in a town that didn't always see him as one of their own. But she also knew his strength, the quiet dignity that had carried him through countless challenges. "If there's anything I can do," she began, but Marcus shook his head, offering her a reassuring smile. "I appreciate it, Sandra. But this is something I need to face on my own." She nodded, respecting his decision, though the worry in her eyes remained. As she left his office, Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for her loyalty, for her willingness to stand by him even when it wasn't easy. But he also knew that this was a battle he had to fight alone. The day passed slowly, tension hanging thick in the air as Marcus went about his duties, his interactions with the other officers strained by the knowledge that Tom was watching, waiting. The younger officers glanced at him with uncertainty, their loyalty wavering as they looked to Tom for guidance. Marcus could feel the shift, the subtle erosion of respect, and it cut deeper than he cared to admit. As the afternoon sun began to set, Marcus knew he couldn't let this continue. He had to confront Tom, to put an end to this once and for all. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the small locker room at the back of the precinct, where he knew Tom would be at the end of his shift. He found Tom leaning against a row of lockers, his posture relaxed but his gaze cold as he watched Marcus approach. A smirk flickered across his face, a flash of defiance that spoke volumes. He knew why Marcus was here, and he was ready. "Sheriff," Tom greeted him, his tone mocking as he crossed his arms. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Marcus ignored the sarcasm, his gaze steady as he spoke. "We need to talk, Tom. This has gone on long enough." Tom's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. "Oh, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I was just thinking the same thing." The tension between them crackled like electricity, filling the small room with an intensity that neither could ignore. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the unspoken animosity simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode. "Why are you doing this, Tom?" Marcus finally asked, his voice calm but tinged with disappointment. "What do you gain from undermining me, from turning this department against me?" Tom shrugged, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Maybe I just don't think you belong here, Sheriff. Maybe I'm tired of watching you parade around like you're better than the rest of us." Marcus shook his head slowly, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "I've never thought I was better than anyone, Tom. I'm just trying to do my job. To serve this community." "Serve?" Tom scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Don't kid yourself, Hayes. You're just here because they needed someone to look good in the papers. You're nothing but a token, a way for the council to pat themselves on the back and say they're progressive. But we both know the truth. You don't deserve to wear that badge." The words hung in the air, each one laced with venom, with a bitterness that Marcus couldn't ignore. He'd heard these sentiments before, had felt their sting countless times throughout his career. But hearing them from one of his own officers, someone he was supposed to trust, cut deeper than he'd anticipated. "I earned this position, Tom," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "Just like you earned yours. The difference is, I don't use my badge to tear people down." Tom's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Walking around here, acting like you're some kind of saint. But I see right through you, Hayes. You're just as flawed as the rest of us. You're not some hero." "I never claimed to be," Marcus replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I do know what it means to serve with integrity. And if you can't do that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hit like a punch, and for a moment, Tom faltered, his defiance slipping as a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But he quickly recovered, his anger flaring as he glared at Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get to tell me what I deserve," he spat. "I've been here longer than you. I've put in more hours, more sacrifices. And I'll be damned if I let someone like you tell me I don't belong." Marcus felt a pang of sadness, a weight settling over him as he looked at the man before him, a man consumed by bitterness, by a need for validation that he could never seem to find. "This isn't about me, Tom," he replied quietly. "This is about you. About the choices you've made, the anger you carry. I can't change that for you. Only you can." Tom's face twisted with rage, his fists clenching as he took a step closer, his voice a low growl. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You think you can take away everything I've worked for, everything I deserve?" Marcus didn't flinch, his gaze steady, filled with a calm strength that only seemed to infuriate Tom further. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Tom. I'm here to make this department better. But that can't happen if you're too busy tearing it down from the inside." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension between them reaching a boiling point, a storm that had been building for months, now ready to explode. Finally, Tom took a shaky breath, his voice thick with resentment. "You think you've won, don't you? That everyone's just going to fall in line and worship you like some kind of hero?" Marcus shook his head slowly, a hint of sadness in his gaze. "This was never about winning, Tom. It's about respect. It's about doing what's right. And if you can't see that, then you're only hurting yourself." Tom's face twisted with rage, his fists clenching as he struggled to contain the anger boiling inside him. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to tear down everything that Marcus represented. But deep down, he knew that Marcus was right, and the truth of it cut deeper than he cared to admit. The silence between them was deafening, a heavy, unspoken tension that filled the room, neither man willing to back down. Finally, Marcus turned to leave, his voice soft but firm as he spoke. "Think about what kind of officer you want to be, Tom. And remember, it's never too late to change." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. The air in the precinct had shifted, thickening with a tension that seemed to linger in every room, between every desk and chair. Officers moved through the halls with downcast eyes, speaking in hushed tones. The story of Tom's confrontation with Sheriff Marcus Hayes had spread, though no one dared to mention it directly. It was an unspoken truth, like a storm cloud that cast shadows even when the sky was clear. And now, a sense of unease settled over them all, as if they were waiting for something inevitable, something that had been building far too long to be stopped. For Marcus, the weight of the confrontation lingered as well. He hadn't wanted things to escalate the way they had, hadn't wanted to expose the rift within his team in such a public way. He'd hoped that reasoning with Tom, giving him a chance to reflect, might bring him back from the brink. But the reality of Tom's resentment, the depth of his anger, was something that Marcus could no longer ignore. Tom's threats, his simmering hatred, those weren't going to dissolve with a single conversation. This was a battle that Marcus knew would require more than words. And yet, he also knew that he couldn't let Tom's bitterness poison the precinct. As sheriff, he had a responsibility to his officers, to the community, to uphold a standard of integrity and respect. But he also felt the sting of Tom's words, the accusation that he was here merely as a token, that his position was built on a foundation of appearances rather than merit. Marcus had spent years proving himself, pushing through the silent prejudices and quiet hostilities, building bridges and gaining the respect of those around him. But now, he felt that foundation shifting, the trust he'd worked so hard to establish beginning to fray. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He was left with a choice that gnawed at his conscience, a dilemma that went beyond the simple exercise of authority. He could confront Tom openly, make an example of him, lay down the law in a way that would force everyone to see where he stood. But that approach risked dividing the department further, creating a rift that could shatter the unity he'd fought so hard to build. Or he could take a different path, one that involved patience and subtlety, a path that meant working quietly, allowing Tom to reveal his own flaws, letting the man's bitterness consume him from the inside out. But that, too, felt dangerous. He knew that by waiting, by allowing Tom's resentment to fester, he might be risking the trust and respect of his officers, letting doubt and suspicion spread like a virus. And so, Marcus found himself wrestling with the complexity of his position, the moral weight of his decisions pressing down on him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The community, his officers, they depended on him. And he couldn't afford to falter, not now. It was during one of these long, introspective evenings that Sandra knocked on his office door once again. She'd noticed the change in Marcus, the heaviness in his gaze, and she knew he was carrying the weight of this situation alone. She stepped inside, her face etched with concern, her voice soft as she spoke. "Sheriff, you don't have to do this alone," she said, her tone filled with quiet determination. "We're with you. And if there's something we need to know, if there's a way we can help, just say the word." Marcus looked at her, a flicker of gratitude softening his expression. He knew Sandra was loyal, knew she believed in what he was trying to accomplish. But he also knew the delicate balance he was trying to maintain, the fine line between asserting his authority and maintaining the respect of his team. "I appreciate that, Sandra," he replied, his voice low. "But this isn't just about Tom. This is about what we represent as a department, what we stand for. And if I handle this the wrong way, it could undermine everything we've worked for." Sandra nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She, too, had seen the division growing, the subtle shift in the way some of the younger officers looked at Marcus, their loyalties beginning to waver under Tom's influence. She understood the importance of Marcus's leadership, the way he became a symbol of integrity in a town that had often struggled with its own prejudices. "Then maybe it's time we show them who we really are," she said quietly. "We can't let fear of division keep us from standing up for what's right." Marcus considered her words, a spark of resolve igniting in his gaze. She was right. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions, couldn't allow the possibility of division to prevent him from doing what was necessary. He'd spent too long trying to appease, to bridge the gap between his officers, hoping that mutual respect would naturally grow over time. But sometimes, respect had to be demanded, especially from those who refused to see the value of unity. The next day, Marcus called a meeting, gathering his officers in the precinct's main room, his face set in a calm but determined expression. The room fell silent as he took his place at the front, the officers watching him with a mixture of curiosity and tension, sensing that something important was about to be said. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady, carrying a weight that silenced any murmurs. "I know that the past few weeks have been challenging. There have been differences among us, disagreements about how we conduct ourselves, about what this department represents." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, his eyes meeting each of his officers' faces, taking in their expressions, reading their emotions. "I want to make one thing clear," he continued, his tone growing firmer. "This department is built on respect, respect for each other, respect for this community, and respect for the responsibility we carry. And if anyone here believes they are above that respect, that they have a right to treat others with anything less than dignity, then I suggest you reconsider why you're here." A murmur ran through the room, the tension thickening as his words settled over them. Tom stood at the back, his arms crossed, his face impassive, though a flicker of irritation crossed his eyes as he watched Marcus speak. "This isn't just a job," Marcus went on, his voice rising slightly. "It's a commitment to serve, to protect, to hold ourselves to a standard that this community can trust. And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're in the wrong place." The room fell silent, a heavy pause filling the air as Marcus's words sank in. The officers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at Tom, others watching Marcus with a newfound respect, a sense of admiration for the courage it took to stand up for what he believed in. But Tom remained unmoved, his gaze hardening as he met Marcus's eyes. He could feel the tension building, the quiet rebellion stirring within him. He didn't like being challenged, didn't appreciate being made to feel small, insignificant. And in that moment, he made a decision that would take him down a path from which there was no return. As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling of relief that he had finally addressed the issue openly. But he also knew that this was only the beginning, that the true test was yet to come. And as he watched Tom leave the room, a hint of defiance in his stride, Marcus knew that the confrontation he'd hoped to avoid was now inevitable. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the precinct grew increasingly tense. Tom's defiance had escalated, his resentment bubbling over in subtle acts of rebellion, small moments of disrespect that he wielded like weapons. He ignored Marcus's orders, disregarded protocol, and openly questioned Marcus's authority in front of the younger officers, planting seeds of doubt and mistrust. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Marcus received a call from a local business owner, a woman who reported an incident involving Tom. She described how he'd stopped her without cause, subjected her to a humiliating search, and spoken to her in a tone that left her feeling degraded and violated. Her voice trembled with anger as she recounted the experience, the pain evident in her words. Marcus felt a surge of anger as he listened, the weight of her story settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't ignore this, couldn't allow Tom's behavior to go unchecked. He was left with no choice but to confront Tom directly, to hold him accountable for his actions. He found Tom in the locker room, his back turned as he stowed his gear. Marcus's footsteps echoed in the quiet space as he approached, his face set in a calm but steely expression. "Tom," he began, his voice low but firm. Tom turned, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Here to give me another lecture, Sheriff?" Marcus ignored the taunt, his gaze unwavering. "I just received a call from a local business owner. She told me about an incident that took place earlier today, a stop that you conducted without cause, a search that crossed the line." Tom's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "So what?" "She was acting suspicious. I did what I had to do." "Did what you had to do?" Marcus's voice was filled with quiet anger, his eyes flashing with disappointment. "This isn't about doing what you have to do. This is about respect, Tom. About treating people with dignity." Tom scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You're always going on about respect, dignity. Maybe that's why this town doesn't take you seriously. They don't want a sheriff who's soft." Marcus took a step closer, his voice low but filled with a fierce resolve. "If being soft means treating people like human beings, then yes, I'm proud of it. But what you're doing, humiliating people, abusing your power, that's not strength, Tom. That's cowardice." Tom's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching as he glared at Marcus. "Don't you dare call me a coward," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Then prove me wrong," Marcus replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "Show me that you're here for the right reasons. Or step aside and let someone who understands the meaning of respect take your place." The silence that followed was thick with tension, both men locked in a standoff, neither willing to back down. The precinct was quieter than usual in the days following Marcus's confrontation with Tom. The tension that had lingered in the air, simmering and swelling for so long, seemed to have finally dissipated. But it wasn't the kind of calm that brought relief. Instead, it was the eerie stillness that often settled before a storm, a waiting silence, filled with a sense of something final approaching. For Marcus, the events of the past weeks had taken their toll. He felt a weight lifting, though he knew it wasn't over yet. There was still one last step he needed to take, one final reckoning he had to confront, and he could feel it drawing closer. He had seen the worst in Tom's behavior, had witnessed the man's disregard for authority and respect, and now, he had to take action to prevent that darkness from spreading further. It was early morning when Marcus received a call from the town council. The council members had heard about the complaints piling up against Tom, and rumors about the tension between the two officers had started to spread. Marcus's actions, his calm but firm approach, had caught the attention of the people who mattered. The council requested a meeting, not just with Marcus, but with Tom as well. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, a chance to put everything on the table, to finally bring an end to the conflict that had threatened to consume his department. The meeting was held in the council's modest chamber, a room lined with wood-paneled walls and simple chairs. Marcus entered first, his face calm, his eyes reflecting a quiet determination. Moments later, Tom arrived, his expression dark, his movements tense and defensive. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of contempt and resentment, but he said nothing. The council members, a group of local leaders who had seen both men rise through the ranks, watched them with solemn expressions. They began by addressing Tom, asking him to explain the recent complaints, to account for the reports of misconduct and disrespect. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his initial bravado fading as he realized he couldn't dismiss the accusations so easily. He stumbled through an explanation, his words defensive, his voice growing strained as he tried to justify his actions. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he did so with a quiet conviction, recounting the events with honesty and restraint. He didn't embellish, didn't attack Tom personally, instead, he focused on the values he believed in, the principles he felt should guide the department. He spoke of respect, integrity, and the need for unity, the kind of unity that could only exist when everyone was treated with dignity and fairness. His words resonated deeply, leaving an impact on everyone in the room. The council members exchanged glances, their decision clear. They had seen the difference between the two men, seen the contrast in their character and values. And in that moment, Tom's fate was sealed. The council announced that Tom would be dismissed from his position, citing his repeated misconduct and failure to uphold the department's standards. The decision was final, and there would be no chance for appeal. Tom's face went pale, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. His years of resentment, his bitterness, had led him to this moment, to an end he could no longer avoid. He looked at Marcus one last time, a mix of anger and regret flashing across his face, but he knew it was too late. He had crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges, and now he was left with nothing. As Tom walked out of the council chamber, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, he realized that he had no one to blame but himself. The anger he had held onto for so long had only led him to his own downfall. And for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, the consequences of a life spent chasing power instead of purpose. Marcus, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief as he watched Tom leave. It wasn't triumph, nor was it satisfaction, it was simply the calm that came with knowing he had done what was right. He had faced the challenge, upheld his principles, and protected the integrity of his department. And now, he could finally move forward, free from the shadows that had threatened to cloud his path. The council turned to Marcus, their expressions softened with respect and gratitude. They thanked him for his leadership, for his courage in standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. They assured him that his position as sheriff was not only secure but honored, that his dedication to the community had not gone unnoticed. For Marcus, this was a moment of validation, a reminder that his hard work, his sacrifices, had not been in vain. As he left the council chamber, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He returned to the precinct, where the atmosphere had already begun to shift. The officers greeted him with a respect that went beyond rank or authority, it was a respect born from admiration, from a recognition of the strength he had shown. They had seen the way he had handled Tom's defiance, the way he had upheld his values without resorting to pettiness or revenge. And in that, they found a leader they could truly stand behind. In the weeks that followed, the precinct flourished under Marcus's leadership. The unity he had fought so hard to build began to take root, and the younger officers, inspired by his example, embraced the values he had instilled. Marcus knew that the journey wasn't over, that challenges would continue to arise, but he also knew that he had built something lasting, something strong. As for Tom, his departure from the precinct marked a turning point in his life. Stripped of his badge, he was forced to confront the choices he had made, the bitterness that had driven him to the edge. He wandered aimlessly for a time, lost in a world that no longer held a place for him. But eventually, he came to a realization, a painful but necessary truth, that his anger, his resentment, had only ever harmed himself. And in that moment of clarity, he began the slow, difficult journey toward redemption, a journey that would take him far from Branton, to a place where he could start anew. Marcus's legacy, however, remained. He had become more than just a sheriff, he had become a symbol of resilience, of integrity, a man who had proven that respect was earned, not demanded. The community looked up to him, the officers trusted him, and for the first time, he felt a true sense of belonging. He had faced the darkness, the prejudice, the bitterness, and he had emerged stronger, a beacon of hope for a town that was finally ready to change. As we reach the end of this powerful story, let's take a moment to reflect on the journey of these two men, their struggles, their choices, and the consequences that followed. Marcus's strength lay not in his title, but in his unwavering commitment to respect, dignity, and justice. He showed us that true leadership isn't about control or power, it's about serving others, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And for Tom, his story reminds us of the dangers of unchecked resentment, of a bitterness that can consume and ultimately destroy. His downfall serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without purpose, authority without respect, leads only to ruin. What do you think? Can a person truly change after making so many mistakes, or are there some paths that can't be undone? Have you ever been in a situation where standing up for what was right felt like the hardest thing to do? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspectives on this complex story. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more narratives that dive into the human spirit, stories that explore moral dilemmas and the unexpected turns of fate. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next tale.